Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Central Bank of Brazil and the International Cooperation Agency of Germany, GIZ, we would like to greet all our speakers and public. We are starting the webinar on regulatory actions on the sustainability dimension of the central bank's agenda. Today, we will have an opening session followed by panel number 1. And at the end of our morning, we will have our keynote speech. For the opening, we will have Ms. Fernanda Necchio, Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Brazil for International Matters and Corporate Matters, Mr. Otávio Ribeiro Damaso, Deputy Governor for Regulation of the Central Bank of Brazil, Ms. Sabine Moderer, Member of the Executive Committee of the Deutsche Bundesbank, and Ms. Annette Winmeiser, Minister of the German Embassy for Cooperation and representative in Brazil for the Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development of the Federal Government of Germany, BMZ. I give the floor to Ms. Necchio from the Central Bank of Brazil. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to our public. I can state very happily here that when the central bank started its AgendaBC hashtag, sustainability, one of the actions that we aimed at and we wish to develop. And today I'm very happy to open this webinar on regulatory initiatives based on the sustainability dimension of BC's AgendaBC hashtag. We hope to develop new partnerships to study metrics and to monitor the maturing of this topic inside and outside of the Central Bank of Brazil. Some of you must have heard me speaking recently in some events, but I want to strengthen the importance of the sustainability agenda for the Central Bank of Brazil and how strongly it is connected to our mandate. The Central Bank of Brazil aims at assuring prices and the efficiency of the national financial system. Therefore, it must continually seek the limits of its action, responding to present and future shocks and risks, to demands from society, and to structural demands from the economy. The actions in the BC hashtag agenda includes actions such as PIX and open banking for the payment means and to evolve society's demands in search for a more flexible, competitive, and safe financial system. Climate, social, and the environment are also present. Our actions in the technological level bring a new sustainability for the agenda in order to respond to a set of structural changes in the Brazilian economy. This dimension reacts to the appearance of new risks and demands from society. Climate events that were considered rare have become very frequent, and these events come together with changes in the major economic variables that we see in monetary policies, besides bringing greater safety to the financial system. Climate shocks, droughts, floods, and extreme temperatures impact relative prices in the economies, and therefore they impact subsequently our economic policies. These events put at risk national systems as well as its currencies and collateral benefits, besides risks and hardships for society as a whole. And therefore, the central bank wants to have laws ensuring stability of the financial system and its prices. And for that, we must be prepared and react properly to structural changes in the economy. The policy formation in the central bank must react and respond to social and environmental risks and their impact in the financial system. The central banks of different countries in mitigating social and environmental risks is a topic that is developing in Brazil and abroad, and it is at this place that we need to be. Last week, I had the opportunity to participate in the first meeting of the boarding steering committee of the Network for Greening and Financial System, and I'm very happy to see that the Central Bank of Brazil is already a part in many work groups and actions in this network, which is a two-way street and a virtuous cycle, which will benefit the central banks and also all the countries from our contributions. The Brazilian Central Bank will also benefit by strengthening and broadening the climate, social, and environmental aspects in all its actions. I do not want to take too much of your time. We have many interesting topics to discuss. This is a dynamic agenda that involves each and every one of us. And before closing, I want to stress the regulatory aspect as one of the pillars of sustainable development in the Brazilian Central Bank's agenda. A significant part of the actions in Brazil in this area come from the regulatory environment. And I've been having the opportunity to participate and to monitor the efforts of the technical areas. I see a promising future for the Central Bank of Brazil in this context, or rather, I see a green future for the Brazilian Central Bank with this agenda. Thank you and have a good event. Thank you for your comments, Deputy Governor Fernanda Necchio. Now I will give the floor to Otávio Damaso, Deputy Governor of Regulation from the Brazilian Central Bank. Good morning to all. It is a great pleasure to participate in the opening of this event organized by the Central Bank of Brazil and by the German Cooperation Agency. First of all, I would like to thank and congratulate Sabine, Annette, Fernanda, who is also from our bank and part of this opening session. And with that, I will greet the speakers who will be with us along the 3 days of this event. I also want to thank the organizers of the event, the German Cooperation Agency, GIZ, our colleagues from the Central Bank of Brazil, who made many efforts to organize the webinar, and also for all the participants in public for being with us and participating during these 3 days. I am sure that many of them are already collaborating on this topic of the Central Bank's agenda. The topic of our webinar today is extremely important. Its importance is very clear for the robustness of the national financial system and also of the global financial system. It is an increasing debate, especially with regards to financial revision. We have been participating in several discussions which have been very deep and profound. And there is no doubt that risks of climate changes have been at the top of our worries. But we must also remember that other risks, social, environmental, and governance risks, have become increasingly more important. And this brings us to a reflection which Fernanda has covered very well. The known relationship between the risks and this topic in general with the missions of the central banks in terms of price stability and financial stability. For example, with regards to adverse climate events, their impacts can be materialized in different manners, bringing risk to markets and strongly influencing the prices of assets in the short, mid, and long term, bringing clear effects on the monetary and financial stability. They can also be materialized as credit risk and also as operating risk for the financial institutions, bringing risk to the legal feasibility and reputation, Brazil has experienced a very strong drought in 2015, and operational risk became a very important factor at that time, especially in the city of São Paulo, which suffered from lack of water supply. And a lot was discussed about mitigation and urgency measures if the drought was to extend. So there is the aspect of feasibility of operations. And this naturally brings us to the importance of this topic and to the construction of the Central Bank of Brazil's sustainability agenda, with including discussions on environmental, social, and governance issues, and this motivated the AgendaBC hashtag, reminding you also that the Brazilian Central Bank was one of the pioneers to implement ESG. We are now in a moment when it is ideal to improve and implement our policies for ESG, because we have reached the end of a cycle which began in 2014, in which we implemented the regulations and went through a supervision process. So this first phase has been completed of our ESG implementation, and it also culminates with many international discussions about the topic. Therefore, we have great expectations for this webinar that is beginning now. We expect to further develop and deepen debates on the topic here in Brazil and also globally. And especially, we want to collect subsidies to strengthen our regulatory framework and all the other actions that are in the AgendaBC hashtag for sustainability. In these 3 days, we shall have many interesting panels. Today, the panel will discuss the prudential treatment of social, environmental, and climate risks, as well as governance risks in the financial scenario. Many questions such as what kind of regulatory treatment will be given to the risks are raised. Tomorrow, we will also discuss ESG and integrated risk management among the banks, as well as the development of databases, risk appetite, climate change, stress testing, and capital adequation. And on the third panel, on Thursday, we will focus on the transmission channels for these risks in the financial system, where we will discuss the main inhibitors and how risks are actually materialized. Therefore, I am certain that by the end of this event, we will have important contributions, especially for the development of the topic and for the construction of our regulatory agenda. Once again, I thank everyone for their participation. To the speakers of the first panel, organizers, the German Cooperation Agency, and my colleagues at the Brazilian Central Bank. Thank you. Thank you for your considerations, Mr. Damaso. I will now give the floor to Ms. Sabine Moderer from the Deutsche Bundesbank.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to start by thanking especially B2B and of course the German GIZ for hosting this well thought out regulatory webinar. Let me also applaud the BCB for its strategic AgendaBC hashtag. AgendaBC hashtag is a landmark statement on the priorities of the Central Bank of Brazil, confirming its really long-standing environmental commitment and shaping its DNA for the future. And let me also talk about BCB's international engagement. As Fernando also raised, BCB joined the Network for Greening the Financial System this year. And this network, also called the NGFS, is a coalition of 75 central banks and supervisors to combat climate change with joint efforts globally. As a founding member, Bundesbank very much welcomes BCB's membership. Brazil is the largest South American economy. Within its boundaries lie 60% of the Amazon, a key factor for biodiversity and for the climate on our planet. Germany, in turn, is the largest European economy with annual per capita carbon emissions that are about twice as high as the global average. And the rapid growth of urban areas and the amount of land covered by transport infrastructure in Germany has indirect global effects as it reduces biodiversity. So both countries, Brazil and Germany, have a particular responsibility to tackle the challenges of the climate crisis and declining biodiversity head-on. With regard to fighting the climate crisis, there are two key insights. Key insight number one, our real economies need to transform to net zero emissions quickly. To achieve this goal, a carbon pricing system is the most important lever. Ensuring an adequate carbon pricing system is a task for elected government, not for the central banks. Clearly, timely action is of essence here. Timely action would allow for a stepwise approach. It would prevent disruptive measures as well as policy errors as a result of time pressure. Key insight number two is that the financial system can drive real economic transformation through transparency and disclosure of climate-related risk. Financial institutions must be put in a position in which they adequately price and manage climate-related risk. A solid foundation is needed as a first step. So a classification system, a common green language for all parties involved, helping them to understand whether an economic activity is environmentally sustainable. The European Union taxonomy is a concrete example of a common green language. It could provide orientation for others to follow suit, even if it's not a perfect solution yet. Adequate information on climate-related risk is a key requirement for making well-informed investment decisions. Reporting companies can benefit directly from providing high-quality disclosure of climate-related risk. Increased awareness and more informed strategic planning will help companies to manage financial risk, particularly in the transition period to net zero. For financial institutions, an in-depth understanding of climate-related financial risk should be an integral part of their risk management system. For example, a bank granting a loan must be able to determine a company's carbon footprint, what proportion of revenues is generated from sustainable activities, and how much it invests in sustainable business models. Financial risk cannot always be avoided, but they must be managed, disclosed, and be subject to adequate pricing. With the right information, risk can even turn into opportunities on our transition pathway to a more sustainable economy. Now, what can central banks do to encourage climate-related risk disclosure aside from their roles in prudential supervision and financial stability? The starting point is that central banks' financial assets are, like those of all other financial institutions, subject to climate-related financial risks. So for the sake of risk management, it is in central banks' own interest that the financial risk of climate change and climate policies should be as transparent as possible. Therefore, central banks should consider only purchasing securities or accepting them as collateral for monetary policy purposes if the issuer meet certain climate-related reporting obligations. In terms of monetary policy implementation, central banks could also examine whether they should only use those credit ratings that appropriately include climate-related financial risks. With such measures, central banks would help promote market transparency and standards at rating agencies and banks. So monetary policy implementation should also be part of the toolbox when central banks act as catalysts for greening the financial system. Ladies and gentlemen, to summarize briefly, first, I'm very much looking forward to pushing ahead with the NGFS agenda together with the BCB. Second, an important goal will be to achieve more market transparency on climate-related risk as a solid foundation for adequate risk management and risk pricing. And third, in their own interest, central banks have an important role to play in the mission for more market transparency. Climate change is the challenge of our times, but we can succeed if we act now, responsibly, jointly, and forcefully at all levels. In closing, let me wish you all a very successful webinar, and thank you very much.
Muito obrigado por suas.
Thank you very much for your considerations, Dr. Sabine Moderer. I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Annette Winmeiser from the German Embassy of Brazil. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to greet all my opening session colleagues, Deputy Governor Otávio Damaso, Deputy Governor Fernanda Necchio, Sabine Moderer, and I'd like to thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to talk about the German cooperation in sustainability. We are participating in an event of great potential, which will change how we think about finance and sustainability and integrating both of these things. The goals, the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Accord towards mitigating risks of climate change is the central focus of the German cooperation agency around the world. As you know, today the Paris Accords are celebrating their 5th anniversary. In Germany, sustainability became a priority for several decades now. I will give you an example. The transition of the energy matrix to renewable energy started many years ago, before the current discussion on climate change. In 2000, less than 10% of energy consumption in Germany was generated by renewable sources. Today, this number is up to 50%. Gradually, we are reaching the Brazilian level, which currently generates around 75% from renewable sources. The goal of the German government is that by 2070, our energy matrix will be 100% renewable. Europeans are especially concerned with the consequences of the unsustainable way we consume. Nowadays, this is a direct and indirect it results directly and indirectly into the accumulation of extreme climatic events. It's a challenge for the economies around the world and for social production systems. And it also weakens political systems. Finally, climate change represents a threat to our security, both national and international. With this, most of the populations in Europe believe that we should no longer waste any time. Time will change. The time to change our lifestyle is simply now. You The European Union has planned investments of more than 1 trillion euros to support the plan for carbon neutrality by 2050. And to implement this, we need a broad portfolio of sustainable investments and a sector that is prepared and willing to channel the necessary investments in a responsible and safe manner. The European Union is leading today the global efforts to transform the financial sector into a more sustainable one. Currently, they are developing and implementing a system of sustainable finance and a political package that is more comprehensive and sophisticated in sustainable finance around the world. Consequently, the member states of the European Union are developing their own national strategies for sustainable financing. In Germany, for example, the set of ministries in finance, environment, and the economy launched a sustainable financing strategy that intends to make the country leader in this topic. At the same time, the financial system NGFS, founded by the German Bundesbank, is also in progress. I'd like to congratulate the Brazilian Central Bank for being part of this great initiative. We are working together with the Brazilian government to integrate environmental, social, and governance risks, in addition to supporting our partners and with financial resources necessary to transform the economy into a sustainable one. In this context, in 2012, Brazilian sustainable policies were launched to work with other partners and the BCB to monitor environmental, social, and governance risks, in addition to standardizing the financial policies in the country. BCB is key in this cooperation, and I'd like to thank the Brazilian Central Bank for assuming the leadership in these actions. Since 2014, BCB has already been leading international discussions with a very progressive environmental discussion. Its strategic planning represents a logical path that is highly appreciated. We would like to start a new phase that highlights even more the importance of this topic during these difficult times that we are currently facing. We are happy to be able to contribute in this sense through our project. I'd like to especially thank the support and management of these activities to the Deputy Governor of International Affairs and Corporate Risks, Dr. Fernanda Necchio. Thank you very much. And also thanks for the vision of two other collaborators of the BCB in this partnership. I am convinced that this partnership can bring many benefits, not only to the stability of the national financial system, but also to the improvement of the financial Brazilian market. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope all of you have a wonderful webinar. Thank you. Thank you very much for your considerations, Ms. Annette Winmeiser. And this closes our opening session of the webinar. We will now begin panel 1 challenges for the prudential treatment of social, environmental, and climate risks in the financial system. The moderator of this panel will introduce the panelists. He will explain the dynamic of the panel and will lead the Q&A session. For those of you who are listening to us on the YouTube channel, questions may be asked through the chat box. Mr. Ulrich Volz, you have the floor from University of London and Director of SOAS, Center for Sustainable Finance.
David, I hope you can hear and see me well. Good. So hello and welcome to this session on the prudential treatment of social, environmental and climate risks within the financial sector. So as mentioned, I'm Uli Volz. I'm the director of the Center for Sustainable Finance at Soas, University of London. And I would like to start by thanking the BCB and GIZ for inviting me to chair this panel at this important conference, which shows the BCB's commitment in this area. And I would also like to commend Governor Campos Nieto, Deputy Governors Fernanda Necchio and Otavio Damaso, and their teams at the BCB on their leadership and for adopting such an ambitious sustainability agenda. On a personal note, I've had the pleasure of working with the BCB on monitoring and analyzing environmental and social risks. And I must say, it's remarkable how committed colleagues at the BCB are in addressing these issues and in seeking to align the financial system with sustainability. And I very much believe that the BCB is really breaking new grounds. And I think that going forward, the BCB will be able to share a lot of valuable lessons to other central banks and supervisors in the NGFS, but also beyond. So in this panel, we will discuss the challenges of addressing environmental, social, and climate risks with the within the financial sector through prudential action. So what should central banks and supervisors do down on the ground to mitigate risk and support a transition to a financial system that is better aligned in meeting sustainability challenges and indeed contributing to solving sustainability problems. And I'm very delighted to have two excellent panelists with me today. We have Rodrigo Porto, who is a financial sector and ESG specialist. And we have Martin Regelink, who is a senior financial sector specialist at the World Bank. And I will say a bit more about each of them in a moment. But let me just give you the order of play. So we will first start with presentations by Rodrigo and Martin, and then we will have a discussion, and all the participants are very warmly invited to post their questions and make comments. So use the YouTube or whatever channel you use function, and you can also write your questions and comments in Portuguese or in English. My Portuguese, unfortunately, is not very good, but I will get a translation, and then I will try to bring as many questions and comments into the discussion. So let's start with Rodrigo. Rodrigo Porto is an expert and a consultant on issues related to ESG and climate risks in the financial sector. And he's an old hand at the BCB. He's had a distinguished career and worked for 20 years at the BCB in financial regulation, including as technical coordinator of the BCB's agendas related to socio-environmental issues in the Brazilian financial system. And he has since worked with different institutions, including with financial supervisors across Latin America. So he's very well placed to give us his take on how to address prudential aspects of social, environmental, and climate risks within the financial sector. Rodrigo, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Eric. I'd like to thank the central bank staff for this invitation. I will move the actually working well. Well, I'd like to thank the central bank for this kind invitation. I'm part of the central bank. I'm really honored to be part of this panel, to be part of this very timely discussion regarding sustainability risks and climate risks. I'll share a screen with you, and I'll start my presentation, which is actually split into different parts. The first one, it's sort of a view of complementary and combined effects between ESG and climate risk. Everybody can hear me? It's okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. So first one is a view of complementary and combined effects between ESG and climate risk.
Sorry, can you make full screen, please?
Yes, of course. Good, thanks. And well, actually, ESG or environmental social risk, as many supervisors and regulators used to refer, well, it's been a real challenge. A decade ago in the central bank in Brazil, it was a kind of a frontier discussion back then. And we feel that now with the climate change issues, and with all the recent discoveries regarding physical risks and transition risks that climate risks represent, the impacts of that on financial sector and economy as a whole, well, it actually represents a lot of things, and it's important to understand how ESG risk framework that is already developed or partially developed in some countries, some jurisdictions along Latin America, how to integrate these collective efforts in order to mitigate all these impacts on financial sector, and also how to get adapt to a sort of undisputed situation, which is climate change. So I'm talking about this integration. I'm talking about these challenges. I'll be very brief and leave some space, some room for Q&As. Well, actually, ESG and climate risk, they're kind of connected and associated to external exposures. So it's a sort of a two-lane road. So ESG, and I won't get much in details about ESG because I suppose everybody knows exactly what I'm talking about, environmental, social, and governance issues. So climate risks, physical and transition risks can impact ESG risk assessment today. So the water stress, for example, resulting from the lack of a rainfall regime can actually exacerbate the level of water pollution, affecting the local activities and the well-being of communities. So it affects the way you assess ESG risk exposures. But on the other turn, if environmental pollution can reduce the capacity of ecosystems to absorb carbon, healthy ecosystems can actually contribute to resilience and better adaptation to climate factors already underway. So climate impacting ESG, ESG impacting climate. So we can say that companies with governance problems or which most pollute or degrade non-renewable economic resources could be likely more exposed to climate risk, extreme physical risks, or also be more exposed to transition risks from other ESG issues that would arise from the climate agenda. And if we think about how ESG risk assessment is traditionally performed, we noticed that this issue has actually evolved in the last years. So if SDG performance was usually tackled to prevent negative environment and social externalities, we do know that ESG externalities can impact the value of financial assets. So banks, investors, they are actually integrating this ESG risk assessments into their traditional risk frameworks in order to mitigate financial risks. And in most of the cases, they're material risks. So they do, they realize that, for example, ESG risk assessment actually doesn't conflict with their role as fiduciary duty. It doesn't conflict with the interest of main stakeholders. They try to use new database in order to assess financial risks that derive from environment and social exposures. They try to screen financial assets. They use good screenings process, best in class, for example, bad screens. They don't take risks in some cases because of environment and social dimension. And there's a lot of things going on in this ESG agenda. For example, the credit ratings agencies, they're actually working on ESG ratings. And this is something to explore a little bit more later. So if we consider a financial institution, and if financial institutions consider that climate change is actually a big challenge in a way that it promotes environment and social externalities, in a way that these externalities impact the value of financial assets, they should do whatever it takes, in a way, to reduce this level of exposure to such environment and social externalities that is promoted by climate change. And they use some specific measuring tools that I believe Martin will take in more details in a few minutes. Particularly the environmental risk analysis, which was promoted initially by the G20 Green Finance Study Group, and then the central banks and financial supervisors networks for greening financial system has also strengthened in a way. And what is actually very interesting in this feedback process is that most financial supervisors and central banks around the world are not dealing climate risks, a typology of climate risk, but they're switching to a more precise concept that is environmental risk. And environmental risks means that climate drivers affect environmental externalities, and these environmental externalities that might be mitigated by ESG risk management may mitigate the risk of bad pricing, of mispricing in financial assets. So there's a very interesting concept here as well, which is the ESG risk management means that not only environmental dimension is there when it comes to measuring externalities, but there's also a social dimension. And we know by now that poor social indicators may impact the environment, may impact the environment by degrading natural resources, by lowering resilience to some of these environmental externalities, most of them caused by climate change. So if you don't tackle social indicators, social dimension risks properly, many of this feedback process could be harmed by lack of better calibration on the modeling currently underway. So this is an issue it's a point of concern. So when it comes to risk management framework within a financial institution, the bank supervisors usually they take a sharp look at the policy underway, in which the risk appetite should be clear, the risk governance framework should be clear, how to set up the mandates properly for all the people inside the organization, responsibilities. And through this risk governance framework, we can better understand how they assess business risk, how they mitigate and monitor those risks, and how they measure and what tools are actually underway in order to mitigate and in order to make financial institutions, financial sector more efficient and more solid. So when it comes to climate risks, for example, it's important to understand the scope of the analysis to understand how it affects business risks. So the scope of analysis of climate drivers seems to be a little different from the scope of analysis of a traditional ESG risk assessment. The exposure to climate risk is usually associated to portfolios, to business models, and the exposure to ESG risk assessments is usually associated to a specific operation during an operational cycle. So we're talking about different data, some specific information, although there are common information, common data that might be used to both risk assessment processes. We're dealing with a very important aspect of a more granularity when it comes to ESG risk assessment. So how to make this feedback process more effective, how to mitigate not only impacts of banking activities on the environment, on the social indicators, in order to make the environment and the social, the communities more resilient, more adapt to climate change, and at the same time to reduce the risks of climate drivers into environment and into communities. So screening, best-in-class scorings, ratings, setting targets and operational limits, and reporting. So there's a lot of possible instruments to be used here on a more granular way in defining which asset is better, in defining which asset is less risky, on defining big targets, for example, through environmental risk analysis. So we can set targets, we can set operational limits to be tackled in a more granular way by ESG risk assessment, and also reporting. Reporting will means that we need to have market discipline. We need to have investors, companies, and banks taking advantage of more information, of more data, in order to apply better assumptions, better premises in the risk assessment procedures, depending on the scope of this analysis. If it's a broader scope in terms of understanding how climate change impacts the portfolio, or it's a more granular concern into specific assets, into specific operations. And of course, the measuring and tools, I believe Martin will get into much details in a few minutes. So the credit, ESG actually has been discussed, especially here in Latin America. Brazil has introduced a pioneer regulation in 2014. So ESG is considered a kind of a cross-cutting risk to credit, which to operational risks, to reputational risk. This is reputational risk. Sorry for this wording. It's not reptile risk. To liquidity, to legal, to market risks. And climate risk seems also to be a kind of a cross-cutting risk. The way that supervisors will approach the definition of these risks, the scope of activities to tackle specific risks is very important for financial institutions, for financial sector. They should have clarity on what exactly is a more granular approach, what to do, what exactly is more the systemic approach, what to do, what tools to use. This is just a picture that shows that climate risk may integrate pre-existing risk management frameworks already in place, like market, like credit, like operational. It should be considered climate risk, or it should be named as environmental risks. But it's important to address that even if we consider environmental risks and externalities that derives from climate change to environmental, to the environment that will create impacts on pricing of financial assets, we should consider that social component, the social dimension is also very important. I recall that the European Banking Authority has made a survey with many banks in Europe, and through this survey they found out that almost 50% of the banks in the region do not use the same risk approach when it comes to environment and social. From the other side, a bit more than 50% use the same approach. It's known, it's well known, it's in a way connected, associated to each other, but the supervisors should have clarity on how to make it transparent to financial sector to better address this issue in terms of their own governance structure, in terms of their own governance framework, to build a very logical and efficient risk management process. I've talked about many challenges already for financial supervisors. When it comes to governance framework, it's very important for the financial sector to have clarity to define different sort of exposures, risk typologies, what's climate risk, what's environmental risk, what's ESG, whether environmental risks can be tackled in a different approach from social risk, for example. And that would impact risk materiality. That will redefine the way the financial sector will assess materiality of current exposures, depending on how vulnerable they are, how vulnerable their portfolios are, how vulnerable the risk the financial assets are. And of course, integrating into corporate policies, it's important. For example, in many regions here in Latin America, we see that the corporate policies address environmental, social issues, and how to integrate climate discussion, climate agenda within this policy, within credit policies and market policies, and addressing mandates, responsibilities, and maybe some components within this governance, like multi-sectoral groups, to bring this issue to chief risk officers, chief financial officers, whatever. And when it comes to cross-cutting risk management, some issues are very important to consider. The first one is the use of common data. So we have, for example, from the G20 Green Finance Study Group, the setting up of what they call the publicly available environmental data, the PIAD, which refers usually to information about temperature rise in different jurisdictions, likelihood of droughts, and frequent floods that may happen in different places. So it's important that both teams the ones that are more involved on environment risk analysis or climate risk analysis, which means a specific kind of assessment, more systemic, with particular tools to address particular exposures and dealing with vulnerabilities of financial institutions in a different way compared to ESG. But common data might be used to both processes. And it's important to develop this database as well. For example, in Europe, we see as the covered bond experience. The ECBC has set up a program along with the academia and financial institutions to set a sort of a database in which they include information on green covered bonds. So they have information on how these green covered bonds that usually allows make loans or they raise funds for smart, efficient buildings. So they can measure the financial performance of these green covered bonds and also the environmental and climate performance of these operations. So you could conform a sort of a database to better understand the risks, whether, for example, these covered bonds, they are less risky than the regular covered bonds. Also, setting targets and metrics derived from climate assessment to drive other risk modeling process through these ESG cross-cutting sort of risks in the credit, in the market, in operational risks. And of course, social risks, especially in Latin America, where social problems are usually very big and may impact the way transition risks may be calculated and may anticipate many risks. For example, it's not unusual to consider that one way to mitigate carbon emissions is through taxation. But how likely most of jurisdictions in Latin America would take this kind of policy to mitigate carbon emissions? More taxations? So we should take into account how to deal with the social dimension because they can impact, they can generate externalities, they can make societies, communities less resilient to climate change, and at the same time, climate drivers may be affected by the way the communities integrate into economic activity, may in a society where you have more social problems, depletion of natural resources may be accelerated, and which might create more externalities leading to more climate risks. So this is a kind of a challenge for everybody. For prudential supervision, it's important to understand, to define the risks. It's important to map data available inside the central bank, inside the banking supervisors, but also outside. It's important to set metrics, proper metrics for risk assessment. And as we're talking about climate and ESG risks, it's always important to foster capacity building. It's a frontier discussion. It's important to evaluate policy signals. And this evaluation may require, for example, regulatory impact analysis, which will complete this feedback process for prudential supervisors. And I think there's a couple of issues here that are very important. And I mean, disclosure and taxonomy. Disclosure means more data, means more market discipline. And to be useful, disclosures need to be standardized across banks, to be reported consistently across time, and to be sufficiently forward-looking. So we have many data providers today. We have the credit agencies. We have, for example, the GRI, which sets up many indicators, many interesting indicators, especially for issuers. We have the SOAS, for example, which holds a lot of information, a lot of data, especially for the ones who are assessing risks in their portfolios. And the other point is taxonomy, which is a big challenge for central banks and financial supervisors, because it's not a kind of an issue that is naturally inserted into their mandate. They should discuss with other policymakers at national level in order to understand how financial sector may take advantage of more clear definitions of what is green, what is sustainable, what is climate friendly, in order to make data formation more likely to happen, and to support risk assessment process, data collection as a whole. Well, I leave the floor to Ulrich, and I'm available for any questions to deep this discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo, for an excellent outline. Before moving to Martin, I would just like to pose one question to you. You've outlined the key elements of risk management frameworks, and just would like to hear from you, what do you think should be the concrete requirements that regulators should pose to financial institutions regarding ESG risk management? So, for example, you just highlighted the importance of disclosure. Do you think, or would you agree with Mark Carney that disclosure should be mandatory? What prudential tools would you recommend, or do you think it is possible to give kind of a blanket recommendation, or does this have to be very specific for each and every jurisdiction? Could you give us a bit of a flavor on your thinking on these points?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Ulrich. Well, first of all, I can't disagree with Mark Carney. It's a very tricky question for me, but it's also a tricky process as well. The central banks must be aware of exactly what requires from financial sectors in order to make this information really useful for investors, and in order to make companies more aware of what they should report as well, to make this risk assessment process more friendly for them. Let me put it this way. I think ESG is a very important issue in Latin America. I noticed that many financial supervisors are already working on a climate agenda, which is very, very important. But so importantly is integrating this climate agenda into the ESG risk perspective, because that's how financial sector might be more efficient in order to bring more soundness to financial sector by ESG risk mitigations, and also to contribute to a more broad climate agenda. There's a lot of discussion regarding, for example, capital requirements. Should we add capitals to non-green assets? This is a sort of discussion that I used to hear all around. And that's also very tricky, because we should think on capital requirement as something very connected to prudential issues, not to policy issues. It's not a policy option, because we should foster sustainable development, but it's an issue to address soundness in financial sector, and to be sure, to be clear, that sustainable assets are less risky than regular ones. We should have information, we should have data to explore in our measuring tools, and we should report it to investors. We should report it to the public. We should make sure we should be transparent on the path that the financial sector is actually heading on. So financial regulators are challenged constantly to whether not guiding the market, but actually showing the best way for them to go. So it's a challenge. In terms of ESG, I strongly agree with the central bank, with what the central bank has done in the last decade, when the central bank addresses that ESG is a cross-cutting kind of risks. It's very, very close linked to credit policies and market policies. So the supervisor should be very, very transparent on this sort of definition, on the typologies they use to make financial sector aware of what are ESG exposures, what are climate exposures, so they can compare this information with their own portfolio, with the assets they hold, what are vulnerabilities that we have, so we can take action. I don't think that financial supervisors should be too prescriptive when it comes to ESG risks or even climate risks. On the climate issue, I'll let Martin explore a little bit more, especially for the uncertainties that we still have in terms of the tools, the available tools. But when it comes to ESG, it's certainly not a process to comply with regulation. It's not just another cost of compliance that financial institutions usually complain from banking supervisors, but it affects prices of financial assets, and it's being integrated worldwide by many different techniques, by many different strategies. And the central bank should be clear to show to the financial sector what information they want from the financial institutions, how they're going to organize themselves in terms of governance framework, and how they will foster market discipline through disclosure, and of also taking advantage or being a leader in terms of discussion with other policymakers in specific issues that it's not actually in their mandate, like what's green, what kind of economic sector should economic policy foster, but they should be part of this discussion as well, because the financial sector is in the middle of everything. So as long that financial sector opened its mind to this big issue, which is environment and social externalities caused or not by climate change, they will be ready, they will be more prepared to make this, to convey this message to the whole financial sector. What exactly do we want? What data do you need to collect? What exposures are you facing? And what are your vulnerabilities? And how you're gonna build your governance to tackle such issues? It's a lot of things to do, I agree. But I think ESG is a very good starting point at this point of time.
Thanks, Rodrigo. I mean, I would like to chip in that I take a bit of a tougher stance on these things. I think it's very clear by now that the risks related to climate change in particular, but also other environmental and indeed also social risks are very material, and that this is a systemic problem and it needs to be addressed in monetary and prudential policies in a very broad sense. And I think it's very good to see how financial markets have moved and how this topic has become so big and it is becoming mainstream in a way in financial markets. But at the same time, I think given the urgency of addressing these risks, I would not want to rely on markets just to do the right thing, because the movement has been, the real action down on the ground has been relatively slow. But let's hear what Martin has to say on these issues. And so Martin, as I mentioned, is Senior Financial Sector Specialist at the World Bank. And at the bank, he's part of the financial stability team, and he leads the bank's work on climate and environmental risk for the financial sector, providing advice to regulators and supervisors around the world. And importantly, he's also leading the bank's work on the financial sector assessment program that the bank regularly conducts with the IMF in countries around the world. And so this is now clearly becoming an area where the IMF and the World Bank are putting much greater emphasis on. And Martin, before joining the bank, worked at the DNB, the Dutch central bank, where he did indeed very pioneering work on climate risk analysis and climate stress testing. And I actually, in my syllabus of my green finance and sustainable finance courses, I always have the study that Martin and colleagues at the DNB did in 2017 on dealing with physical and transition risk, waterproof. It's still a very good read. And I think we're very lucky to have you with us, Martin, to hear your insights. Please share your presentation with us.
Thanks a lot for those kind words, and great to hear that the study is part of your syllabus. Let me do this tricky part here. Okay, I think it's, yes, I think you can see it, right? No, thanks a lot, and thanks also a lot to the Central Bank of Brazil for inviting me today, and obviously also for the other panelists, Rodrigo, for his insights. I think, you know, this is, I think to me that's very interesting what Rodrigo is doing and what he's telling, and what the Brazilian Central Bank basically has been doing on the ESG and sustainability front. And now that you see that these two worlds of climate risk analysis and guidelines by supervisors are starting to meet. By the way, one thing on my biography, I'm leading the FSUP climate part, not the whole FSUP, so I don't want to upsell myself too much here. But again, thanks a lot for being allowed to share my views, which are based on my experience at the Dutch Central Bank, as well as you know, the experiences that I had over the past few years with the World Bank. Okay, so I mean, let's start a little bit from the basics, and I will try to go through it fast, right? I think this is what everyone knows, right? The dichotomy between the physical risks, that those are the event-driven risks that come from climate change due to warming, right? By the end of the century, scenarios, you know, could end up with 5 to 6 degrees of average warming. I mean, those are in the very bad scenarios. But obviously, at the same time, we take transition measures, and we have to, because if we want to meet the 2-degree target by 2050, we need to be around carbon neutral. That's an immense target. And, you know, it really means that we need to restructure economies in a very, very big way. And I think that's important to not forget. And obviously, there are all these different risks coming from that for economies and also the financial sector. Just to note, particularly on emerging markets, since that's the focus, of course, of you know, the World Bank's engagements, these markets tend to be more vulnerable to natural disasters and the impacts of climate change in general, and particularly compared to, you know, some of the developed countries that have, particularly on the climate part, maybe have taken the lead, but most affected are countries in Africa and Asia, and also in the Latin American region, which I think is the second most affected region in the world in terms of natural disasters. And many of them are climate related. I think the past 2 decades, 1,200 events have been hitting the region. About 1,100 are climate related, and some of the most severe are droughts, storms, floods. In this graph, you also see earthquakes, which usually lead to a lot of damage. So then you're talking about the broader set of environmental risks. Now, at the same time, we also see that, you know, many emerging markets that we work in are very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, which, you know, the warming, the sea level rising, the increased frequency, for example, and intensity of events. This is not spread equally around the world. You know, this happens to some extent. It's different in parts of the world, and we see that many of these countries that we work in are are heavily affected, including, or could be heavily affected, including the LAC region. These countries also, the countries that we work in, the emerging markets often tend to be the countries that are less ready to deal with the impacts of climate change. And that's what this scatter plot shows, where we have taken a vulnerability indicator for climate change impacts and set that against some macro financial vulnerabilities that countries face. And you see, the least prepared basically that a country is, the least reserves it has, the worsened fiscal position, and even the worsened financial sector vulnerabilities often correlate with high climate vulnerabilities and low readiness to deal with them. So that's on the physical side. I think on the transition side, if you look at the emerging markets, it's a mixed bag, right? And how much transition risk you face, although all countries in the end have to decarbonize to some extent, depends on the development path of a country. So, of course, the bigger developing countries emit much more CO2 than, some of the least developed countries in the world. And there are some countries that are highly dependent on CO2 intensive products, particularly related to the fossil fuel industry, whose business model basically is at very, very high risk. Now, this, ties that whole story of the economic impacts to the financial impacts, and we heard Mr. Ottavio speak about that as well as Sabine from the Bundesbank. We have the physical and transition risk, which lead to all sorts of economic impacts, including business disruption, asset destruction, lower values due to stranded assets. And that again leads to the well-known financial impacts that we know. So market losses, credit losses, because borrowers can no longer, for example, repay their mortgages if their home is destroyed, or the underlying collateral could be affected. Underwriting losses due to the insurance industry facing some of these climate-related events, and obviously there are also all sorts of operational risks connected to climate risk. I think there's some good news, right? And that was alluded to by Ulrich as well. We already see that in the financial sector, participants are taking this more and more serious, right? We see that they start to increase their understanding in risk management and the core functions of risk management, as Rodrigo also laid out. There's high overlap with how you look at climate, I guess, and how you look at broader ESG issues in the governance, right, of a financial institution, where you see more and more that board members start to interact on it, really take the agenda on board. And I think it's super important to have a champion, and also make sure that you have a clear strategy around it. And I think that is not only because of the risks, it's also very much because of some of the opportunities that they see, right? A very big Dutch bank, for example, already a few years ago had two main pillars in terms of strategy. It was fintech, and the other one was sustainability and climate, just because they saw a lot of business opportunities, I guess, to sell in the end more loans. And I think that's the type of dynamic that you would like to see. There's initiatives around disclosure. I think the FSB has done tremendous work with its recommendations, and you now see it potentially being picked up by accounting standard setters as well, which really pushes this to the frontier of reporting. And then, of course, product developments. We initially started a lot of talk around green bonds. I think the bigger ticket item is to integrate it across all products and the core products that the bank has, including mortgages and sustainability-linked loans is also a big theme, where banks give incentives to the industry to really green, for example, due to an interest discount. So some good news. That being said, much more can be done. I think, as Ulrich was alluding to, forceful action by regulators is definitely, I think, very, very important building block in that. At least, that's what we see. That's what we see globally. That's what I also experienced a lot in the Netherlands. I think the network for greening the financial sector, it was mentioned before, and obviously Brazil is an observer. I mean, they have done tremendous work with collecting all the insights on how to assess risks and what type of guidance you can give as a supervisor, particularly on climate risk. They're now branching out to other environmental risks as well. But it just went very fast, right? I think in 2 years' time, they went from basically a group of 12 or so initial steering group members to now 75 members. I think last week, the Federal Reserve also joined as a member, and there are 13 observers. The World Bank is among them. It's not only the network for greening the financial sector, right? We now see that the standard setters, which are very important, to lay some sort of global minimum on how to look at these items, and also very important for us as World Bank, because we use them, for example, in our FSUBs to give advice to regulators on how to deal with these issues and benchmark them, are also stepping up. So we had already for a while the International Association of Insurance Supervisors, who has issued recommendations jointly with the Sustainable Insurance Forum. The Bank of International Settlements has recently set up a high-level task force on climate risk, which is headed by my former boss, Frank Ellison, who's obviously also the chair of the NGFS. So, much more to expect from them in the near future. IOSCO has the capital market, standard setter has a sustainable finance framework, and also issued guidance for capital market regulators. And then the pension, association has done similar work. And then last, but certainly not least, as already mentioned, the Financial Stability Board really kicked it off, right, a few years ago with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. But they're also picking up again on financial stability risks. I think yesterday they released a report on that front, and they are keen to do more on data. Very much in alignment with the NGFS, by the way. Then to the World Bank. We also are very much picking up on this agenda, and it basically has two core pillars, I would say. Well, first of all, the Financial Sector Assessment Program. So for those who don't know what that is, it's a long-standing program the World Bank has jointly with the IMF for 2 decades now, whereby we assess countries for both financial stability issues, as well as how can a financial sector better contribute to economic development. We give basically every country in the world, more or less, is assessed each 5 to 10 years, and it's benchmarked against peers. So regulators are benchmarked how they, for example, regulate and supervise a financial market for soundness and stability issues. And we also look at these development issues, as I mentioned, and we give advice to central bank governors and ministers of finance. That's where we present our reports to. It used to be, and it still is, very traditional way of looking at, banking regulation, capital market regulation, all those things. There's little technical notes on that, and then there's a bigger report on top. But very recently, like 1.5 years ago, we started to introduce a climate and environmental risk and opportunity module, which is a technical note, a holistic technical note, which focuses on mapping out these vulnerabilities from climate change. IMF also comes in with their stress test capacity on that front. We benchmark supervisory approaches against the NGFS guidelines, amongst others, and also of the other standard setters. And then lastly, we also look at the green finance part. So, what is the financing gap to make the NDCs? And what are the barriers out there to make them, and how to address some of these barriers, for example, through disclosure or strategy, or particular instruments, or using your national development banks. We go all over that and give advice. And so far, we have done this in 4 countries. It's Bangladesh, Philippines, Trinidad and Tobago, in the Latin American, Caribbean region, as well as South Africa. And the feedback has been very good, and this product is evolving, and we will do it in many more countries. Then lastly, we also have TA, technical assistance programs across the world. One is in Colombia, where we, amongst others, support the banking regulator with assessing climate risks. We support them with, integrating some of those risks in banking guidelines and pension guidelines, as well as a taxonomy. And this is really kicking off. We see that there is a lot of demand, and this has particularly been created, I think, with the help of the NGFS. Let me take the last part of my presentation to get you a little bit in depth on risk assessments and stress testing. I think that has evolved quite a lot from the time that I worked on waterproof, and is a very important, entry point for many regulators, as it lays the foundation of your knowledge and your supervisory engagements, and is also a very big awareness raising tool. So if you look at the stress testing, what it basically does is connecting different models, whether it's climate, macro models, into these stress test models. So there are distinct steps, I would say. The first is define your scenarios, right? Transition risk or physical risk scenarios. The latter are often modeled, for example, as a storm, a 1 in 500 year typhoon or hurricane that can hit. What would happen? Or a 1 in 500 year flood. Then you can either directly map some of these impacts on, for example, non-performing loans or probability of defaults or loss given defaults, so the underlying collateral, if you have historical data, but often that's not there. And what you then do, you use a macro model. So that's, you use, for example, on the transition side, that's what DNB has been doing. You can see the flow below. They used for the transition risk a fictive carbon price of $100 per CO2 ton, and feeded that in their existing macro model to see what would happen with GDP. I think they proxied that through an oil price spike. And then again, they also try to have some sort of vulnerability indicator, what would happen per industry, because of course there's a lot of diversification per industry, and that information they connect then to both sectoral exposures that a country has, and on the physical side, also to regional exposure, right? If you know that a flood, for example, is happening somewhere, you will particularly stress test those portfolios and see what would happen to non-performing loans, for example, in that particular region. And the outcomes then feed all this information is then basically collected in the big, stress test black box, where, it's not that hard. Eventually, you will look at what would happen from particularly loan losses or other instruments to the profit and loss account of a particular financial institution, and you would look at then feed that information again into the balance sheet, look at what it does to provisioning, and ultimately capital adequacy of banks, and you see if there are adjusted shocks to it. So in this type of stress testing, I think what is very useful is that the NGFS has basically laid out the high-level framework of the type of scenarios that you can look at. You see the quadrant on the right. Two of the most used scenarios are likely the disorderly one, right? If you have a very disorderly transition, so say a very abrupt carbon price or very hard measure or technological change or market sentiment that's changing, that could lead to disorderly impacts, and I think the other big one is the hot house world. So if you would really end up in a 6-degree warming or a bit less, what would happen to, for example, all these events, and how would they be affected, and then how would that affect the financial sector? I must say, at the same time, I think it is vital. It's absolutely vital to not only look at these high-level global scenarios, but look at the specifics in your country. That's what we really see in the SAP, that there are, for each country, it basically has its own unique set of scenarios and dynamics. Whether it's on the physical side, you have particular physical risk. You're either mostly affected by drought, like what we see, for example, in South Africa, or Philippines, which has this massive typhoons, or Colombia, which may be more affected by floods. It's very important to look at those specific dynamics. And again, on the transition side, there's also much to explore what's under the hood in terms of economic structure and how that all feeds into play. So that's, I think, an important lesson. Don't only follow these high-level scenarios. When you do this type of assessment, a basic starting point, and what can give you a lot of insights already, is just look at your geographical and sectoral exposures by banks, right? And overlay that with some sort of easy risk mapping. I think here we have the example of Colombia, which is public data, by the way, where you can basically compare, very detailed mapping of credit exposures with where most of the sensitive physical climate risk areas are. Again, we looked at that for flooding. And as well, the sectoral breakdown of data per bank, and you can add it up for stability purposes to see how exposed are my banks to some of the most highly CO2 intensive sectors, right? It can give you already important insights, and also as a supervisor, you can start conversations on that. and this is my last point, one important challenge that we are now facing, and which is super important to take into account, is the challenge of factoring in climate change. Of course, particularly also on the physical risk side. This is a challenge, and we have now done that in the Philippines. We have started to experiment with that under the FSUP, and one of the most interesting insights that I think that we got, and you see it here on the right side, is how extremely events can intensify due to, if you would take some of the extreme climate scenarios. I think this is the 8.5 IPCC scenario. So the blue line basically gives the damages for a typhoon under certain return periods, say a 1 in 100 year or a 1 in 200 year event. If you would factor in a climate change, we would see even on average a rise of 50% in impacts. And these are already some of the biggest typhoons in the world, which can lead to massive damages also compared to GDP, particularly if they hit, say, a capital region. And the reason that they become so much more, damaging is particularly they don't increase in frequency, they increase in intensity. In particular, in this case, water is warming. And the reason that they are more damaging, there's a lot of non-linearities here. I think the word was already mentioned. If you have a weak storm, maybe buildings will still, keep on standing. If it's a very, very, very severe storm, everything basically at one point falls over. So, I mean, this is very emerging work. This is very new. And we also try to see how that then can feed into stress testing. So the point here is don't only look at historical data, because you will miss probably a lot of the impacts out there. So with that, I'll give back the floor to Ulrich for maybe some follow-up questions or the discussion.
Thank you very much, Martin. And indeed, the forward-looking nature of climate risk, that's indeed one of the big challenges, because we've never gone through a climate crisis before. Martin, may I just ask you some follow-up question? Could you elaborate a little bit on some key lessons that you've learned from the financial sector assessment programs that the World Bank and the IMF have done together, and also the TA that you've conducted regarding the relevance and management of climate risk in emerging market financial sectors? And also a side question, you mentioned that the World Bank is looking at conducting more climate risk analysis in FSUPs going forward. Do you think that may actually become something kind of a standard item kind of for all countries at some point?
Okay, thanks a lot. So let me first start with some of the lessons and then the standard item. I think some of the lessons learned in particular, and here I relate a little bit to my Dutch experience in the Netherlands. In Waterproof, amongst others, we started to stress test. We didn't call it a stress test then, it was too sensitive at the central bank to call something like that a stress test. We looked at the risk of massive flooding in the Netherlands and what would happen to bank portfolios. And we had to stretch it kind of a bit to really get to the most impactful scenarios, because there's a safety net and there's this world-class dike system. So you end up in 1 in 1,000, and if you would have like a really nuclear type of scenario, you would have a 1 in 10,000 year event, right? So that's a bit of the perspective that I had on these type of events. So when I start to get into countries like Bangladesh or Philippines, or even South Africa also in terms of drought, you just see that these risks are so much more material already now, right? Bangladesh, I think every year floods for I think 20% of the country is flooded almost every single year. And in a very bad year, once in 10 years, it can flood, I think up to 40% of the country is flooded. Philippines is, every year it faces 19 on average of these hurricanes, and it faces some of the biggest in the world. I think 8 of them make landfall. So that was, I think, to me, very much an eye opener. South Africa fighting these droughts all the time. It's an eye opener. It's just there. It's already ongoing. It's infused by climate change a lot likely already. And it's not a unique type of event even. So I think that's one thing. Also, connected to that is in many of these emerging markets, I found that the lack of safety net. So, when we did the stress testing type of exercise in the Netherlands, you find very big numbers from these flood impacts, but you also find that there is a system which probably makes it that the government would take in the end around 60 to 80% of any damage. So that's good news for banks, right? Because it means that a lot of the impact is basically taken off. Say, a house is destroyed, the government will repay. So it will help the bank either collect its loan back because the person is just able to still do his business or whatever, or it's basically an insurance against the collateral out there. What I do find interesting, particularly on the risk management side, I think, and that's connected to Rodrigo, is that I did see in some of these emerging markets that we work in that there has been steps made quite a lot on these ESG type of guidelines. And some of them are super detailed as well. And I think there's definitely more to learn from what has been doing on that front. What I do see is the climate risk ones tend to be slight, the ESG frameworks often do not cover climate. So I think that's a particular omission that is now being more and more integrated, as Rodrigo said. And what I also found in some countries is, and I'm not speaking per se about Brazil, I've not looked at that in detail, but for some countries, you see that the framework is not per se related enough, I would say, to the traditional supervisory framework, right? The things that you would ask from a bank in its internal capital adequacy assessment, or the way that the supervisor then would look at that through, for example, the SREP type of processes. So there is definitely, a discrepancy in some countries that can be made. Lastly, I would say, and this, this point is about also what I said in the end, what we learned from FSOP, I think was super interesting from all the analysis that we did, how useful these natural catastrophe models are, and that the insurance industry is basically using for assessing some of these risks. So they produce all sorts of events that could happen, say a 1 in 500, 1 in 1,000 year event. They model 10,000 of potential events. So the damage figures from these events can then feature into these macro models that I explained. So building losses, that can give you a number in terms of GDP loss or sectoral loss or household loss. I mean, macro modeling is a bunch collection of models. And that again can be used in traditional stress testing. So we found that super useful and learned quite a lot on that front. So in terms of your question on FSOP being done more and more across the world, I think that's currently ongoing, right? I think you have seen also from Kristalina Georgieva quite some wording around it. So the IMF is now also stepping up this, and the way we tend to work is we focus very much on where is this now most material, right? Where is it? Because it's always a bit of a trade-off. You have all these competing issues. I mean, if a banking sector is exploding due to some sort of crisis, you might want to focus your attention to that to some extent. And of course, in the pandemic situation that we live in right now, that can be the case, right? That there are all these dynamics going on. But I do think there's a lot of attention, and you will see it popping up in more and more countries, because in the end, most countries are affected to some extent, if not all. But it's always a bit of a trade-off in terms of materiality against other issues that also deserve attention under the FSOP.
Thanks, Martin. And I think I would like to reinforce the point that virtually all countries are affected by climate change, and obviously for some, physical risk will matter much more than transition risk, and vice versa. Some will be hit very badly by both, and so we do need indeed a very detailed analysis on a country-by-country basis, and of course, and also the exposure of the financial system will differ. So we've had questions coming in from the floor, and I will pick up some. Let me first pose one question to you, Rodrigo, from the floor. So I don't have the names of the people who've posed them, but Rodrigo, could you please elaborate more on the topic of scope of analysis of business risk mentioned in your slides, considering the aspects of mitigation and monitoring?
Sure. Thank you, Rick. Well, I think besides the due diligence procedures that a ESG risk team should take into account to check compliance over ESG performance of the clients, for example. I believe that the supervision team in financial institutions can use additional information to assess how their clients, how these assets are contributing to mitigate or to make financial institutions more adept to physical and transition risks. That means that when we talk about climate risk assessment and the scope of climate risk assessment, we are considering specific externalities posed by climate risks, how these externalities impact the assets, impact the portfolios, and what exactly should we do in a more granular sense to mitigate or to get adapt to such externalities. ESG, and when I mean ESG, I mean environment risk assessment. And when I mean environment risk assessment, inside the credit area, so if you were making a loan and if you address a specific loan, and if you have specific data on that was brought by a climate scenario analysis, by an environmental risk assessment previously, so you have conditions to take advantage of this information and to make your due diligence properly in a much more granular way, requiring some specific information. So we're talking about complementary and combined effect. That's why I try to use this expression in the beginning of the presentation. So currently, we see a lot of discussion in the mainstream regarding environment risk assessment. I believe that the scope of a truly ESG risk assessment would stretch this particular concept, taking advantage not only on the environmental externalities, but also social externalities and governance externalities. When it talks to environmental risk assessment or social risk assessment or ESG risk assessment, this is something very particular to each jurisdiction. But I believe that ESG may be the front line on actions taken by financial sector to mitigate or getting adapt, not only to climate risk, but also to different exposures to environment and to social and governance dimensions that may impact, that may create some sort of externalities. So the example of credit risk assessment is very clear for me, in which all information that was brought by climate risk assessment may be channeled through a specific team that goes through a more thorough and specific and target assessment on specific operation, on specific assets, to make sure that these externalities that were tackled by climate risk assessment would be mitigated in a way. So it depends on the bank to mitigate the impacts, the externalities caused by specific operations, but at the same time, they acknowledge that some of these externalities, they are undisputed, and financial institutions can do very little to mitigate that particular exposure. So when I think about different scopes, I mean, traditionally we used to say that ESG is a way to mitigate impacts, and climate risk is a way to get adapt to impacts. But they are getting closer. These approaches are getting closer. Consider the new trends of ESG risks. Consider the way that we could mitigate the externalities and how it impacts the value of the financial access of the underlying financial assets. So it's a different scope in a way that we have a broad perspective in terms of ESG. We have the possibility to have access to more granular information, to make clear the use of credit, to integrate some of these information into the credit policy, into investment operational policies, but rather to use other sort of dimensions like social and governance as well that may contribute to mitigate externalities as well.
Thanks. I have a follow-up question for you also from the floor. Which sort of information and data should central banks collect and keep? And what data should be disclosed to the public in terms of ESG and climate risk? And you're also asked to give some examples. And of course, Martin, if you want to comment on any of these questions, also feel free to chip in, but I have some more questions for you directly as well.
Yeah, sure. Should I start? Okay.
Yeah, please.
Well, I'll give an example of the central bank. The central bank requires some informations of georeferences in their credit operations. It's a kind of an action that can really contribute to better assess the scope, the nature of the operation, the nature of how the community will be affected by the specific economic activity that's been funded. It's also compliance to environmental legislation, and it's analysis of how climate events should impact community, the activity that's under development. So this is a kind of information that eases the implementation of what the central bank in Brazil is calling the Green Bureau, according to the new sustainability agenda that they have just launched in 2020. And this is a kind of a data system that should encompass different information regarding agricultural finance, to be done in compliance with the current financial policy and with the current agricultural policy in the country, encompassing not only these specific information of georeferencing, but other information that is gained based on crossing different bases. For example, the publicly available disclosure data regarding, as Martin has stated before, how specific externalities will impact different regions. Brazil is a very big country, so the way that physical risks will impose externalities to different regions varies a lot. So the goal of this initiative is to also allow some process of certification more quickly, more accessible to many of these borrowers. So they will share the information. This information will be kept by a private bureau or public bureau. In case of central bank, it's a public bureau. And this information will be shared, will be accessible to banks, to investors, so they can acknowledge if the borrowers are compliant, are in compliance with the current regulation, legislation, and also what sort of climate risks may be posed according to the region, or the place, georeferencing. It's very refined, very sensitive, and it allows the bank to know exactly what place the operation will be made. So this is a sort of action that's very, very interesting for the central bank when it comes to a credit bureau, because it helps not only to assess risk, but to raise new business opportunities.
Thanks, Rodrigo. Martin, I have a question for you. How should the climate-related risk be considered or included in the core principles for effective banking supervision? And maybe you can extend on that question kind of a bit more broadly. What do you consider the key prudential actions that central banks and supervisors should be taking? And also, to what extent do you see differences across or between developing emerging economies and advanced economies? Because you've been working on both.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I can allude to that. By the way, on Rodrigo's point, I agree. It's all about as detailed as possible. Granular data on per industry, per region, ideally per region, per industry. And I think that measuring green finance is a very important thing as well. And there we need these taxonomies because it's very hard currently to do that, for example, on industry classifications. But on your question, I like this question. I think it's one of those areas that we hopefully will see the needle, at least from my perspective, move forward also with this high-level task force that has now been set up by the Basel Committee. I mean, in our assessment framework, we try to look a little bit with one eye to these existing principles that are out there, as well as some of the NGFS guidance to see how the two match. And actually, they match quite well. I mean, the BCB just gives very high level. It gives some principles about the supervisory powers and tools and approaches to supervisions, as well as expectations on what you can demand from financial institutional risk management, governance, reporting. And basically for all those areas, you can have recommendations on what a supervisor can do. And if I look at what are very important parts are the internal governance and strategy, like what the Bank of Brazil now has done. I think to have something like that, and also have it at that level that I heard Otavia recently also speak at a World Bank Fed conference. To have someone like that carry that agenda is very important. It's a key step, right? And that's what we had at the Dutch Bank with Frank Elderson. I mean, he pushed it everywhere. I think you need someone like that to carry it forward. Then again, I think the tools and assessments is an absolutely vital first step to take, in my opinion, because you really need to have a deep understanding how your financial sector is affected by some of these risks and all these different dynamics that come into play that I alluded to a little bit during my presentation. And it will allow your supervisors to have a much better conversation. So that's one of the things that we tend to advise, as a baseline. And then lastly, I think once you have that in place, those two steps, I think the expectations that you might have on risk management, governance, strategy, and also stress testing, I think that's an important area, as well as reporting and disclosure, are key. And again, that all relates to the Basel Core principles, though there's maybe more detail behind it, the way that NGFS now has laid it out. And then you asked me also the difference between advanced economies and what's the difference? I think many emerging markets that we get to are at the early stages of the climate risk integration, I would say. So that's what we see. I mean, they have now heard of it. They took note, and they are aware that it is impacting already their financial sectors. They have become, many of them now recently have joined the NGFS, and it's a recent field anyway. But most of them do have some background, particularly on the broader ESG type of frameworks. So I think that's where they are coming from, and that's, I think, a different type of way they have started. The social aspect tends to be a more important element in emerging markets that we see come forward in all these discussions. Also, when you talk about specific climate risks, but if you go to South Africa and talk about climate risk, it immediately is also about a just transition and make sure that there could be risks, of course, from alienating parts of the population in such a transition as well. And that is all that's all come into play, and as well as how financial sectors then can also help elevate some of these development issues, I would say as well. So that's, I think, another difference that just comes up in the conversations. One last point is, I think, transition risk tends to be, for example, for a country like Netherlands, it's very clear cut, and they want to do something about it. For other countries, it's sometimes also a little bit more of a sensitive issue to some extent, because there's a development path that they're also on, and they want to develop. So I think that's again comes back to how you have that conversation and what you want to do about it, and how material it is versus other objectives that you might have.
Thanks, Martin. I mean, on the last point, I would like to add transition risk is not only domestic, but clearly also has a very important international dimension. And just to give two examples. So the European Union is now discussing not only to have a more ambitious climate agenda domestically, but also part of that package may indeed be carbon border tariffs. So basically, anyone who wants to export to the European Union may face carbon border tariffs. And since almost everyone wants to export to the European Union, and it's a very important export market, including for countries in Latin America, this is a potential transition risk that may be biting. Or another example, we have now an increasing number of countries that have declared the goal of moving to net zero carbon emissions, including the European Union, but we've also had Japan, South Korea declare that goal. China has declared the goal by 2060. We just have a change in administration in the United States, and we will see dramatically different climate policies. And so if you're a fossil fuel exporting country, for example, if you're Indonesia and you're exporting a lot of coal to China, that is a big transition risk, right? So it's not only about, kind of domestic ambition in reducing carbon emissions, but it's also very much a global international risk, and this has to be factored in. But I wanted to pick on one point you mentioned, Martin, and I was pleased that you mentioned it, and that was the just transition. So the just transition, this is the notion that we won't be able in having successful climate policies if these are not just, if the people who are affected, for example, from a move away from fossil fuel-based economy, if they get new opportunities. And for this, we need the financial sector to play a very important role, because we need the financial sector to step up investment in new sustainable activities that will provide new jobs. And another aspect is that very unfortunately, climate change is hitting poorer parts of society, and also indeed poorer countries much more severely than richer ones. So climate change itself is extremely unjust. So I think this argument that developing countries can't really afford to deal, kind of have climate policies and so on, is very flawed. But I think there is an important role of how the financial system can help the transition and indeed make it just. And I'd like to invite Martin, and also you, Rodrigo, to give a few thoughts on that, if you may.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, by itself, not an easy subject to unpack, right? I think a lot of thought needs to go into what the exact role of the financial sector around a just transition is. But let me try to give a few points. And by the way, I fully agree with your point on externalities, that can come from global trends and that then face a country. It's not only domestic. That's a very good point. Thanks for adding that. But a few things that we see and that we have done discussions on, also as part of the EFSA part that focuses on green growth and deepening markets around that point. I think there's definitely an important role here for some of the public financial institutions that is often overlooked. So the national development banks, those are the banks, for example, that are really there for the public good, right? And they should tackle some of these issues. Many of them at this point do not have very explicit green mandates, for example, or very explicit social, but they have social mandates, obviously, but they don't have it very much connected to green. And then also particularly some of the, communities that are most affected. So I think that's definitely an area where more attention could be paid to see how they can facilitate, making sure that there's more money available. And then there are other options for a government, right? Some sort of strategic investment fund where you would blend some of the finance for some of the most affected parts of society. You as a government or MDB would take the most risky a part of the investment and let others, also make some profit on it to create some sort of structure. I think that's one. Another very important part is insurance, right? And insurance many communities are underinsured. There's just no insurance. So what could you do to make sure that there is micro insurance available for the poorest parts of society, so that they are able to cover some of the physical impacts of climate change? It's not per se related to the just transition concept, maybe, but broader, I think, to cover some of the impacts that they face, I think is very important. And there are also new ways, right, on insurance, like satellite-based type of insurance, which would make it much easier to pay out any claim that they have, make the insurance much cheaper. Could help and could be facilitated. A last thing, I think this is a topic that should be taken into account when taxonomies are designed, right? You then choose which basically it's somewhat of it's a technocratic, but also a little bit political choice on which sectors or subsectors are seen as green or sustainable, and which you see as less sustainable. And by doing so, you potentially aim to have more funding available or more labeled green financial products for these areas. I think taking into account very much both the transition effect, right? Like there is a transition for some of the more brown sectors, but also the just and social concept is important when designing such things. So with that, I maybe Rodrigo has other points to add.
Thanks, Martin, and thanks, Eric, for the question. I couldn't agree more with Martin. I'd like to add in this particular point a concern that we live today a different environment, a different situation than we lived a couple of years ago. 2020, everybody knows what I mean. And the trends and the signals of the policy signals that try to address the problems of climate change and economic sustainability, they depend on the level of social pressure to resolve problems like social exclusion, inequality, and other issues. And the cost of this transition, it should be understood in different regions, so that the local financial sector risks be considered in a very proper and timely way. I think that the crisis of COVID-19 at this respect may strengthen this transition risks and the cost of it that should be taken into account in the many simulations underway. We have, for example, the fiscal packages that tend to affect the capacity of investments from governments, especially because they need to address the government to resolve some specific healthy problems. And if it's true that the sustainability agenda is strengthened by the current healthy crisis, which exposes actually the big problems that we have due to social inequality and the fragility in attending the sustainable development goals in many countries, especially here in Latin America, I believe the transition risks, they take a very relevant role in the process of environmental risk analysis. In this perspective, new policies and the social costs may vary substantially according to the social and economic reality in each jurisdiction. And we should even consider the role of activism, the social pressure in this direction. So I think analysis should allow financial supervisors to better understand the challenges of the sector and the implications to provide financial services according to the nature of each jurisdiction. So anticipation of risk may take domestic financial sector to play a very important role in the analysis of social factors, aiming to support local adaptation, social additionality policies, and even research, which is very important at this point of time.
Thanks, Rodrigo. I do sense a lot of agreement among us that environmental, climate, social risk really have to be seen together, which it's not easy to disentangle them and find the right indicators, but clearly there are a lot of interdependencies. So we have exactly 5 minutes left before we have to close the session and give the floor to the keynote speaker, Luis Pereira da Silva. And so we need to finish on time. I did have some questions coming in relating to the link between environmental risks and climate risks, because climate risks are obviously only kind of one part of environmental risk. And so we know the NGFS is now seeking to broaden its scope, look more at environmental risk. And could each of you maybe just give a 1 minute answer, and really literally 1 minute, on how you see the connections and what could be done about it? Well, either of you.
Okay. Yes, as you mentioned, I believe it was very important for the NGFS to address the concept of environmental risk, because in a way, it tries to give a sort of not a common approach, but try to get the environmental dimension already in place in many jurisdictions a little bit closer to what the mainstream is calling climate risks, and this relation of this connection, complementary and combined effects between externalities in terms of environment dimension and climate dimension is very important to be understood by a more systemic approach from a financial institution, from a financial sector, a financial supervisor, but also in the front line, where operations are being generated, where actions can be taken concretely in order to address some of these mitigation points, in order to address how companies are getting adapt to this sort of climate risks. I think more engagement, especially from central banks and banking supervisors in Latin America and other parts of the world, is necessary to deepen this discussion, how to better approach climate risk mainstream into what is actually in place in many jurisdictions in terms of ESG risk assessment. Inserting the social dimension of that, inserting the need to address how other specific environment and social externalities actually impact the value of financial assets and may have some sort of interconnection with the externalities caused by the climate drivers. It's not a simple issue, it's a challenging issue, but I hope that financial supervisors can get into this agenda effectively.
Thanks a lot. Martin, your 1 minute answer.
Yeah, no, very good. I think, first of all, there's a lot of interlinkages, right? We know that with biodiversity and climate. And, a particular story that I came across when I was in South Asia is, for example, in Bangladesh, they have all these floodings, which increase due to climate change. But there's also the issue of pollution of rivers, for example, due to the garment industry, not cleaning the water. And then the water flows every year. It gets into the lands, the food is poisoned, and people die prematurely. So there's a direct link on how these feed into each other. And it's interesting, and that's, you should watch them. Same time, I think what we see in supervisory land and also NGFS is that basically we see that a lot of the same frameworks apply for climate and as well for environmental risk assessment. It's also about the physical risks and the transition risk of, for example, closing down certain industries along the river. I've seen that in Dhaka playing out, for example, in Bangladesh and other parts of the world. So those can be used. I don't think we have yet. There's much more work to be done to have the type of Minsky scenarios that we have more elaborated on for climate change, to really say what are the stability type of events that could happen. But I think there's a lot to explore. Take a look at some of the documentaries of David Attenborough, then it gets in your face. Last thing, I think many of the same steps can then be taken, right? Have these awareness raising studies, and then have guidelines there as well, and connect it, I think, into a broader package, potential of environmental and social risk. The thing that Rodrigo has been advocating, I think makes a lot of sense.
Thank you, Martin. Yeah, I think the risk of biodiversity, Minsky moments, is a threatening one, but it may actually not be as far away as we wish. But so I'll have to wrap up now. But I think it's been a fascinating discussion. It's always a good sign if we could go on, and I do think that there would be so many more things I'd love to discuss with you. But we'll do that another time. I'd like to thank both of you very much for excellent presentations, excellent comments and discussion later on, and to the audience for bringing in very good points. And of course, for the BCB and GIZ for hosting this discussion, and I hope we can continue this. And with this, I'd like to hand over to the next session, and I'm very much looking forward to listen to the keynote of Luis Avazu Pereira Silva from the BIS, who's been one of the other champions in driving this agenda. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to thank our moderator, Ulrich Volz, and panelists Rodrigo Porto and Martin Regeling, and also our public who sent their questions and comments. We will now begin our main speech. We have with us Mr. Luis Avazu Pereira da Silva from the BIS, Bank of International Settlements. Mr. da Silva, you have the word. Thank you very much, David. It is a pleasure to see old acquaintances from the Central Bank of Brazil.
English. I would like first to thank the Central Bank of Brazil for the invitation. Would like to congratulate the Central Bank of Brazil for the agenda that they have put forward, the sustainability agenda, and also salute Deputy Governors Otávio Ribeiro, Fernanda Necchio, also Sabine Moderer, who was in the previous panels, and also Rodrigo Porto and Martin Regeling that were participating previously in the two previous panels. I would like to share a presentation with you to engage into my presentation, and let's see if you can see the presentation that is in the screen, and you can hear me well. David, can you see the presentation and hear me at the same time?
Yes, I can.
So I will try to talk in this keynote about, of course, sustainability under the angle of climate change, but also the contribution that central banks can make. And my point is a little bit like a retrospective of departing from the view that we could have a single actor or a single policy being a sort of a silver bullet to address these issues of climate change, towards a view that is, I think, a bit more pervasive now, of in fact having coordinating multiple agents and several actions to achieve the objective of fighting climate change. So I think the starting point that we all have in mind as economists may be a few years ago or a decade ago was the very elegant general equilibrium Arrow-Debreu word of simplicity before we got alerted by some of the complexities of climate change. And then in this very nice, elegant, and simple word, if you had local negative externalities like pollution by firms, and even if households had no really information about the costs of these externalities, if you started thinking of using tax policies, which is a component of fiscal policy, and essentially taxing this negative externality, maybe using, for example, a Pigovian tax applying to carbon and therefore having a carbon price, you would have a transformation of the world that would be done by a cost-driven reduction of pollution by firms. You would have households changing their behaviors because of the increased cost of consuming high carbon footprints. And with that, you would sort of be gradually in control of global negative externalities, for example, such as greenhouse gas emissions. You would have, because of these price mechanisms, under the beauty of a general equilibrium framework, a reallocation of resources, the changes in behavior by households, by firm, and eventually by societies. And you will be able, with this sort of single instrument, to change the scenario of global warming. Now, we know that unfortunately, this is perhaps necessary but not sufficient. And in fact, what we observed is quite a more complex world where the growth of greenhouse gas emissions went uncontrolled because of very limited appetite to tax these negative externalities. You had lobbying by agents, you have skepticism, you have the tragedy of the horizon, therefore a myopic behavior. You couldn't achieve an effective pricing of carbon. And as we know, there was a lot of problems of political economy with the tragedy of the commons and the sort of a behavior that was more free riding on what others were doing, that was preventing reallocations of resources. So despite some cost-driven repricing of pollution by firms, you have actually an increase in greenhouse gas emissions, and the frequency of catastrophic events threatening price and financial instability grew. So in fact, instead of having the beauty of this single instrument, single actor model solving problems, you have actually the accumulation of problems. You have the
possibility.
We had a technical problem with our keynote presentation, and we are only waiting to reconnect. I believe that in a few moments we will be able to reconnect, and I thank you all for your patience and comprehension. Unfortunately, we were unable to reconnect with Mr. Luis Awazu Pereira da Silva so that he could continue with his presentation. Therefore, we will close the session for today. And on behalf of the Brazilian Central Bank and the International Cooperation Agency from Germany, GIZ, I thank the participation of our moderator, speakers, and all participants in this first day of our webinar. Have a wonderful day.